This is a story about how the West was resurrected. We talk a lot on this show about the recovery of the Western ideals, right? We talk a ton about how the values and the art and the ideals of the West are being buried under just a mountain of crap. That's why we're young heretics, is because we want to shrug off all of that nonsense, all the identity politics, all the kind of racialism that tells us we can't be proud of reading Homer or Shakespeare or what have you, right? All of that nonsense is threatening right now to bury the greatness of the West under its giant mountain of crap. And so I thought it would be good on this episode to talk about somebody who is often credited with kind of digging the West up out of the grave in many ways, in another period when a lot of kind of classical ideals had fallen out of favor. And I'm thinking here of somebody we don't talk that much about anymore, but we should. This is Francesco Petrarca, Petrarch, right? We don't talk about Petrarch too much. We talk more about his kind of rough contemporaries, especially Dante Alighieri, and we will, of course, talk about Dante on another episode. We'll probably get our pal Michael Knowles on to maybe talk about Dante. But Petrarch doesn't get as much play as he should anymore. He used to. He was a pivotal figure in the history of Europe during the 14th century. So this is the 1300s AD. That's where we're at right now in time. And he did a lot of things that would set the stage for the Renaissance, for this transformation of the world away from kind of what had been a set of medieval ideals that was a little bit more, I think, focused on Christianity only. That is, Christianity in abstraction away from the classical antiquity, from pagan antiquity, right? Because remember, there's a complicated relationship, which we'll talk about, between the Christian church, which believes it possesses the sole truth, and the tradition of classical antiquity, which predates the coming of Christ, and in many cases doesn't even have anything to do with the Jewish tradition. So Plato, right, and Aristotle, and these Greek philosophers, and then the Roman poets and philosophers, these guys were not Christians and they were not Jewish, and therefore they stand outside in some sense of the scriptural tradition. And the church has a complicated relationship with that. So Petrarch is kind of credited, along with Dante and a couple other people, Boccaccio, some of these Italian folks in Italy, with bringing back a high estimation of the classical ideals. Now, that's not to say that people like, medieval people like Thomas Aquinas were not very interested in, and in some cases enamored of, the Greek philosophers. But it is to say that this notion that we now have, that one half at least of the richness of the West comes from Greek and Roman antiquity, this notion was contested in the 14th century, and Petrarch was one of the people who kind of really fought for it and championed in it. And so I'd like to go back to him and just ask a little bit about, well, how does one do that? How does one reach back into a forgotten tradition as the Western tradition is sort of in danger of becoming forgotten? How does one reach back and revitalize, breathe new life into that tradition, that old mode of thinking and doing things? And something that I think is going to emerge as we talk about this is that you can't actually go back in time, right? And this is something conservatives need reminding of, this, I think, in our noble quest to reanimate the past, right? We can't actually recreate the conditions of the 14th century or the 5th century BC or even the 13th century or whatever period in time. Maybe we're medievalists and we want to be back in the medieval era. The past is past. The past is over. And so when we say that we are here to recover the old ideals, what we mean is we're here to understand them anew and afresh in the context of now and of the present moment. That's also why we've spent time with people like T.S. Eliot on this show, with modernists, right? Because we believe that we are in a period, I believe that we are in a period of decline in the West. I think the West is in real trouble. I think America is in real trouble. And I firmly am endorsing sort of turning back the clock in that sense. But I have no illusions that we're going to do it in a way that kind of makes us all go back to wearing togas and walking around with no electricity, right? Like, that's not what we're about here. We are about finding ways in modernity to return to and revitalize the past. And I think Petrarch had a number of really really miraculous ways, almost, of doing that. And so we're studying Petrarch here as a way, as kind of an object lesson in revitalizing the past, because that's something that we want to do, and we want to do it right, and not just in this kind of hoary, nostalgic way that's never going to work. So let's talk about Petrarch. The man was insanely prolific. He produced a ton of literary output, and we are only going to have time to review little bits of his work here. The thing that he's most famous for, and we're going to deal a lot with this, the thing that he's most famous for is a book of poems called Il Cansoniere. That's the songbook. And we sometimes also call it the rime sparse, which is the kind of scattered rhymes, selected rhymes, or just sort of a few rhymes, basically, is like a rough way of translating that. One of the things that's intriguing about that is that rime sparse is an Italian translation of a Latin title, Rerum Vulgarium, or Vulgarium Fragmenta, fragments of common things. And what's again intriguing about this is that right off the bat, the fact that we are calling these poems by an Italian name translated out of Latin is huge and revolutionary in Petrarch's day. This is a point at which it's only just becoming fashionable and possible to write high art, to compose celebrated poetry in what you call the vernacular, and that is the language that is not a kind of erudite scholarly language, which in this era is mostly Latin, right? People are speaking, churchmen speak Latin, and to be educated is to read and write in Latin. And Petrarch is born in 1304, which means that he's born at a time when this tradition of kind of erudite people speaking Latin as a kind of common tongue. So you can be from any country, you can be from any region, and you can still speak this kind of high, elevated Latin. That tradition is well established in his day, but there are also artists who are starting to push at the boundaries of it. In particular, there are these poets, the troubadour poets, the troubadour poems, which you can still read. Many of these are sort of around, and they are being written in forms of local languages and local dialects. And Italian, which is developing at this point out of many different dialects, is sort of coming into its own at this time, is one of those languages in which people are starting to write poetry. And people who want to do this are having to find a way essentially of justifying themselves, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. You know, you would never have to justify now, here's why I'm writing this book of poems in English and not in Attic Greek, right? You would never have to do that. But they had to do this. And actually Dante, who is, again, sort of one of Petrarch's more famous contemporaries, slightly older than Petrarch, and right about the time that Petrarch is born, the early 1300s, he wrote this incomplete essay defending the vulgar tongue, defending the common tongue, over and against the kind of artificialized grammatical tongue, like Latin, which is where you kind of learn this artificialized language. But he says, no, your common tongue is your natural way of speech. And speech he kind of traces speech all the way back to the book of Genesis. He's trying to give it this noble heritage by saying, look, God invests us with the power of speech. It's something that's central to our humanity and our relationship with one another as humans. And so Dante has really already made this case for something which, again, in classical antiquity, people had made this argument before, that the language you speak from birth carries with it these little heirlooms of your ancestry. And this is still true. We don't give this enough credit. And it's one of the reasons why when people say, oh, we have to, teach Ebonics. We can't teach just, English, the standard English language. We have to teach these kind of pidgin forms of language. I get really not just annoyed, but kind of sad about that, because a language is one of the central ways that a common people, a people together, can share memory, can share ancestral memory. I mean, think about the fact that our language, English, has all of these roots in it, these etymological kind of back roots from French and from Latin and from Greek and German, and this kind of huge, it's like a graveyard of old metaphors and old ideas that find their way into the English language. And together, just without even thinking about it, we kind of have this huge store of shared ancestral meaning. And that's why poetry, English English poetry is so powerful, not just because one individual guy is super smart and writes interesting stuff, but because he's drawing, every time he uses even just a very meaningful word, he's drawing on this huge history of all the times that that word has been used. And this is true also in this new Italian poetry that's coming into its own in the 1300s AD, and with Dante and Petrarch, right? These guys are saying, if we have to write this kind of clinical Latin, this learned language only, we won't have access to these huge kind of earthy, natural wellsprings of meaning that are less structured, less formalized than a kind of scientifically engineered language like a common tongue, but have instead this sort of natural randomness to them of these words and sounds that people are used to hearing from youth, right? Kids are raised speaking Italian, or they're raised, in our case, speaking English, right? And you lose that kind of natural language or natural rhythm and music of your language if you are not writing in the vulgar. And so people are making this defense at this time when Petrarch is born and slightly thereafter. And Petrarch, and this is going to be a theme, Petrarch has this kind of wry, complicated relationship to this thing. So all his life, he would make a show of kind of despising the Rimas Barca, his lyric poems, his book of short poems, because they were just vulgar trifles written in the vulgar tongue and not in Latin, in the vernacular. But at the same time, right, he would use those poems, these poems written in Italian, to bring some of the intricacy of Latin and Greek poetry, which he loved. He was a scholar of classical poetry. And one of the wonderful things about the Greek and Latin poetic tradition, for those of us who speak Latin and Greek, right, is that the poets did these fabulously sophisticated things with the structure of language. The fact, for example, that you can rearrange words in a sentence in Greek in different orders way more than you can in certain modern languages. Like in English, you have to kind of go in a certain order of words, and in Latin, you have much more freedom, and they would do these tremendously sophisticated things. Poets like Horace, the great Latin lyric poet, would do these tremendously sophisticated things with language. And subtly and sneakily, what Petrarch does with the Rimas Barca is he kind of brings that intricacy into Italian verse. And his poems are also very intricately constructed, but they're intricately constructed according to the rules of Italian, which are different from those of Latin and Greek. And so he's basically, this is one of the ways in which he is revitalizing the tradition of Greek and Latin poetry, but not by writing in Latin, right? He's sort of facing this world where people speak Latin, but the learning, classical learning, has kind of fallen dead. And he will get into more of what he had to say about that. But it's this idea which comes up in Paul's letters, right? The letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. That even though many people know Latin and even indeed compose in Latin and Greek, there isn't the same kind of aliveness and vivacity to them as when they were living languages. And Petrarch is kind of digging into his Italian heritage and making it out of Italian something as great as Latin was. Because of course, Latin once was just a natural language that people grew up speaking. And now it's not that anymore. And Petrarch is sort of saying, well, I have this natural language that is not that sophisticated, and I have this dead language which is very sophisticated. And how do I take the sophistication into the living language and kind of breathe new life into it? And one of the ways he does that is by kind of collecting all these allusions and references to classical antiquity in his poems. But he also then layers it over with this new Christian outlook and this heritage of the sort of Judeo-Christian society, which the Greeks and the Romans did not live in. And so, at least the ancient Greeks and Romans did not live in. And so he's kind of ushering in this classical nobility and grandeur into this very lively modern thing, which is poetry in Italian, in the vernacular. So let's read an example. Let's start off with one of these poems from the book, the Rimas Barca, this collection. And by the way, this is another thing that Petrarch is sort of thought to have been the first to do, is to collect a book of just poems. He himself, over the course of his life, composed these poems and put them all together into this one big book, Il Cansoniere, or the Rimas Barca. And other poems, so for example, Dante wrote La Vita Nuova, which is a compilation of poems, but has these sort of prose introductions and interludes in between the poems. And this idea that you would collect a series of poems and organize them into a sequence that isn't necessarily narrative. It doesn't start at the beginning and go to the end, but has this very careful, artificial construction of it. That idea kind of originates with Petrarch, which, if you think about it, is a groundbreaking thing. You know, the idea that there could be a book of poems, and now that sort of thing didn't always exist, and now it exists. So here's poem number 189, and the edition that I'm using here is a translation by Robert M. Durling. It's Harvard University Press, and it's interesting because it's a prose translation. We're going to get into this a little bit, and I will read some of the original of Petrarch's poems. But Durling basically says, you know, there's no way to quite capture what he's doing with Italian here, so I'm going to let you read the Italian, and then I'm going to give you kind of its meaning. But he does a pretty good job, I think, of translating. So here's poem number 189 of the Rima Sparsa. My ship, laden with forgetfulness, passes through a harsh sea at midnight in winter between Scylla and Charybdis, and at the tiller sits my lord, rather my enemy. Each oar is manned by a ready, cruel thought that seems to scorn the tempest and the end. A wet, changeless wind of sighs, hopes, and desires breaks the sail, a rain of weeping, a mist of disdain wet and loosen the already weary ropes, made of error, twisted up with ignorance. My two usual sweet stars are hidden, dead among the waves are reason and skill, so that I begin to despair of the port. That will give you a sense, an idea of the kind of poetry that Petrarch is writing in here. It's highly introspective, highly emotional. It deals mostly with unrequited love, which we'll get to in a bit. But at the same time, it's also, its artifice is very great. It has this very delicate and careful attention to which allusion. So Scylla and Charybdis, this is from the Odyssey, from Homer's Odyssey, that epic poem of Odysseus' journey home. Scylla and Charybdis are these two kind of monsters that you have to journey between, and it's like being between a rock and a hard place, or between making a Hobson's choice. It's just this impossible journey fraught with danger. And then I think he does this really interesting thing. Et al governo siede il Signore, and at the tiller sits my Lord, which immediately takes us, if we're Christians, right, it takes us to the stories of the disciples traveling with Christ in a storm. And what happens there is Jesus kind of wakes up, he's sleeping, but he wakes up and he calms the waters in the storm. And so for a second, you think you've got this kind of little Christian hint that actually everything's going to be okay. But then at the tiller sits my Lord, rather my enemy, right? So this kind of lifting of expectation and then this turn to no, in fact, there is only despair. Very, very careful, delicate, strange combination of Greek and Christian allusions here. And the intricacy here is borrowed both from the kind of Italian form and from the sort of Latin references, myths, stories, and the Latin kind of interest in the careful placement of words, the careful arrangement of lines. These poems, formally speaking, were hugely important in the development of what would become modern lyric poetry in the West. So Petrarch does not invent the kind of poems that he's writing here. Most of them, I would say, are sonnets. And they are now sometimes called the Petrarchan form of a sonnet. Sonnet is a 14-line poem, usually with a 10 or 11 syllable line. And in English, they're in iambic pentameter. Da, 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 right? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. That's what a sonnet is in its line structure. And then you have different rhyme structures and different kind of traditions and expectations about where your ideas are going to move. So in the Petrarchan scheme, in the Petrarchan rhyme structure, which he makes really popular in Italian, it's 14 lines. You have one section of 8 lines and one section of 6 lines. And in the middle, there's what's called a volta, which is the turn. It's where you kind of shift into something unexpected or new, or you cash in the kind of ideas that you've been playing with in the first part. And so Petrarch usually goes, in terms of rhyme scheme, he goes A, B, B, A, A, B, B, A. So you have A rhymes with A, B rhymes with B, and then you have C, D, E, C, D, E. So you kind of switch in the middle into this new thing. The English language sonnet is slightly different than this, but the idea of this kind of careful intricacy of these 10-syllable lines is picked up by all these English poets, by Chaucer in the late 1300s. It's translated into English in the 1500s by these guys, Sir Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey. And that's how we get to this sort of standardized 10-syllable line and this interest in the kind of intricacy of the sonnet form. In this book from 1589, the Art of English Poetry, George Putnam has this interesting quote here. He says, as novices newly crept out of the schools of Dante, Arioste, and Petrarch, they greatly polished our rude and homely manner of vulgar poesy from that it had been before, and for that cause may justly be said the first reformers of our English meter and style. And so here we're looking, right, at guys like Chaucer, but also Shakespeare, right, to sort of the celebrated as the great English poet. So Petrarch, who kind of recovers this and makes the sonnet into the place where the liveliness and the strangeness of Latin lyric poetry can kind of be reborn. We owe to that this huge, long tradition in English as well of all of this stuff, and this is the English poets, the great English poets would look back on this as as a pivotal moment for them. So that's kind of, formally speaking, this tremendously new thing that Petrarch is doing here is that he's finding ways, he's feeling out ways in Italian to do what the classical poets did in Latin and Greek, and he's finding ways to do that while also layering on the Christian worldview and outlook. So we're going to get now more into sort of how he marries those two things. But first, let me pause and say thank you very much, as always, for listening. It's great to have you here. This is a wonderful part of my life. I hope it is a wonderful part of yours too. If you haven't yet, do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, what have you. You'll get a new episode every week, and sometimes we do little extra specials as well. And then if you like what we do, then I encourage you, in fact, I implore you to give us a 5-star review on iTunes. It's really helpful for the show, helps us spread the word, and you can tell your friends too. All right, thanks for being here. Let's get back into the poetry of Petrarch. So Petrarch, as we've now said, is dealing with a paradox, and it is what I would call the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life paradox, right? This is this ancient idea, right, from the Bible, this Pauline idea, that when you hold on to old forms, the thing that made them great kind of leaves them. And this is something that is deeply tragic about the world. It's part of being, I think, in a fallen world, that we can't just preserve things as they are. They're always changing, and reality is moving on, and language is changing too, right? We can't just sort of freeze the Latin language in amber and all speak it, much as I might like to, right? We can't freeze the past in amber, and we can't just go back and live in a better time. We have to be in this time with this language that we have on our plates at the moment. And yet, Petrarch discovered, and I think we can discover too, that you can dig back into the past and kind of come up with gems that you then sort of put into new settings, the way Petrarch did with Italian. And he's doing this also literally. There are these old dusty manuscripts that are sitting around, in many cases undiscovered. And Petrarch, who sort of, his dad kind of wanted him to be a lawyer, but he gave that up basically after his dad died. Petrarch is traveling around Europe and seeking out the manuscripts that have gone unused in libraries and libraries of the church in many cases. And so he's resurrecting these ancient things that have gone kind of neglected and putting them back into Italian. There remains for him in this project this tension between the pagan world and the Christian world. That tension has arisen for us already on this podcast, because I am a Christian and some of my listeners, I believe, are also Christians and ask sometimes about conflict between the Greek and Roman mindset and the Christian mindset. That is an ancient conflict. It goes back to the Bible. Tertullian, one of the earliest church fathers, 2nd century AD, writes in his prescription against the heretics, famously, he says, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" Which is a question that I think we are responsible for answering on this show, because I have said already that this is a show about the West, and by the West I mean the cultural inheritance of Athens and Jerusalem, these two great pillars of the tradition. And there is a mindset in Christianity sometimes, in some forms of Christianity, that says, we have nothing to do with the Greeks. They don't know anything. We know all the truth. We have this Bible, which contains the fullness of revelation, and Jesus is the whole of the truth, the way, the truth, and the life, as he says, and therefore, why bother with anything else, especially with people who weren't Christians, like people like Plato and Aristotle? That tension is very, very old. We deal with it still today. Petrarch was dealing with it. There is, of course, also another Christian way of answering this question, which is to say, and it goes right back to John 1, the first chapter of John's Gospel, in which John kind of gives this depiction not just of Jesus' life on earth, but of, the second person of the Trinity, the Son, through whom all things were created. And so any wisdom, any truth that exists in any tradition must, if it's not Christian, be kind of a half inkling of the Christian truth that would eventually come and be fulfilled. And so this sort of Christian interpretation says Christ doesn't just fulfill the Hebrew scriptures, he fulfills all wisdom. Everything that has ever been worthwhile or true or good is contained ultimately and entirely in his life, his words, and his sacrifice. So that's kind of where I come out on this. I think that there were many kind of deep truths discovered by the Greeks, which were ultimately just sort of intuitions and inklings of the fullness of truth, which is still being revealed to us every day in the life of Jesus. There were a lot of people in this period, the 1300s and just before, Petrarch's period, who were grappling with this idea in much the same way. Dante, in the Inferno, which is his kind of imagined journey into hell, Dante puts a lot of the great classical thinkers just on the border of hell, because he can't really say, oh, we condemn them entirely. They were just these pagans. But he also can't, attribute to them the salvation that only Christ gives. And so he puts them in this kind of gloomy middle region. And Petrarch, too, would struggle with this all of his life. Many of his great heroes, in fact, perhaps all of his great heroes, were heroes of the Roman Republic. These great models of classical virtue. Cicero, whom we've talked about before at the end of the Republic. Scipio Africanus, the great war hero who defeated Hannibal, the Carthaginian. And in 1345, Petrarch makes his great discovery, his biggest discovery as a classical scholar, which is that he finds a manuscript of Cicero's letters to Cicero's dear friend Atticus in the library of the Cathedral of Verona. And so, as I say, these manuscripts exist; they've been preserved, but they have not been widely published and disseminated. And this is it's a huge discovery. It's one of the great kind of finds from antiquity. And Petrarch himself would go on to model his own personal collections of letters on this sort of Ciceronian compilation that he found, this manuscript. And he wrote these great works celebrating the deeds of the ancients, right? Quite notably, he wrote this sort of epic poem, Africa, on Scipio Africanus. And then he wrote this sort of book called Viris Illustribus, which is this celebration of great men. And it's got two books. He's got one with pagan heroes and one with sort of biblical and mythical heroes. So he's holding up these ancient paragons of virtue and his heroes and saying, how can I just consign these people to the dustbin of history? If I really want to say that, if the going thing is that Christianity is the truth, how can I accept that? How can I live in that truth while also not just completely dismissing all these people whom I know to be good and interesting and valuable? And this is not, that people argue about how sincere Petrarch's faith was. I think that that's kind of a modern pretension that we have, where we always want to sort of, because everybody was kind of, a part of the church at some point during this period, we kind of want to discern like proto-atheists and dissenters. So I don't give a ton of weight to this, but, on some level at least, Petrarch was drawn to religious life. His dad, as I said, wanted him to study law, but he dies in 1326, and then Petrarch embarks on this life of literary study. And he becomes, in 1330, a private chaplain in the service of Cardinal Giovanni Colonna, who would be one of his dear friends. And the Colonna family is tremendously important. This is a period when this system of patronage, artistic patronage, is getting going and will enable a lot of the great literary output and artistic output that's to come in the following centuries. And so, like I say, there's kind of this debate, and Petrarch is always very elusive. He's never quite, sincere or direct in his writing, or at least we can always suspect that he's sort of putting double meanings in there. So we're not sure, was this a sort of sincere Christian, or was this somebody who was living within the structures of the church in order to enable him to do his life of kind of wandering about and traveling and pining after this beautiful woman and, writing beautiful poems. And, Boccaccio, who was the sort of younger contemporary of Petrarch and would become both his admirer and his friend, Boccaccio would give him crap for, like, you've just spent all your time with princes, basically, and you weren't really, living the rich, artistic Christian life, that you sometimes maybe claimed to be. So there is, even in antiquity, there is this suspicion that Petrarch is not totally sincere about his Christianity. But on the other hand, he's been part of or involved in the church for most of his career. He's been, his family, when he was very young, moved to Avignon in France, which is where the papacy was at this point, from 1309 to 1376, which is very nearly all of Petrarch's life. The papacy was in Avignon because of these power struggles it was having with the French state. And so, people ask, was this a time when, politics was really actually more important to him than faith? Or was his faith a big part of why he's moving about and going where he's going? And there's this much discussed kind of letter in which he describes climbing Mount Ventoux, which is in southern France. And this is in 1336 he does this. So as his career is beginning to flourish, he's already in the service of the Colonnas. And in this letter, he recalls this kind of religious experience that he has on the mountain. He climbs up to the top of the mountain. He picks up Augustine's Confessions, which he has with him, and he reads this passage from the Confessions. He says, "And men go about to wonder at the heights of the mountains, and the mighty waves of the sea, and the wide sweep of the rivers, and the circuit of the ocean, and the revolution of the stars. But themselves they consider not." So this is this Augustinian kind of accusation that you're traveling up to these mountains, and you're interested in the natural beauty of the world, but you're not looking inward to your heart and your soul. And so Petrarch says, "I closed the book angry with myself that I should still be admiring earthly things, who might long ago have learned from even the pagan philosophers that nothing is wonderful but the soul, which, when great itself, finds nothing great outside itself. Then, in truth, I was satisfied that I had seen enough of the mountain. I turned my inward eye upon myself, and from that time not a syllable fell from my lips until we reached the bottom again. How many times, think you, did I turn back that day to glance at the summit of the mountain, which seems scarcely a cubit high compared with the range of human contemplation." So you can see he's really hard to pin down, this guy, because even in this moment of supposedly sort of Christian revelation, he says, I could have learned this from the pagan philosophers too. So he has this, he's not going to let go of his love of classical antiquity, but he does kind of have this series of reflections, I think, during this period about his immortal soul and about the spiritual life of his inner self, which is sort of more important than all the riches of the world. And you get that in his poems too, which are not, they don't kind of celebrate the grandeur of nature always just for itself. They're kind of tend to be more interested in the kind of the landscape of inside, the landscape of the inner life, which is something we still carry with us. It's an influence that he had on us as well. And he's kind of, bobbing and weaving between his actual interest in the religious world and in his interior life, his need to have good patrons, and his careerism, his kind of willingness to play in the field of erudite high society at this time. And then also his passion for the ancients and for the pagan world, which he has to defend against kind of Christian attack. Or attack by some Christians, let's say, because of course other Christians are with him in his defense of the pagan world. And so out of this productive tension of these various forces come these lyric poems, which are described in tones so passionate that somewhere in them there has to be sincerity. And this is this kind of delicate, soft inner world that he reveals to us with this enormous intensity of feeling. And he packs all of it into these little poems. As we said, the sonnet's just 14 lines, right? So he's packing it all into these little poems in the Rima Sparsa. And he centers it all. And this is part of the kind of artifice of the book itself. He centers it all around this unrequited love for a woman named Laura. And this was, Giacomo Colonna, his dear friend from the Colonna families, doubted whether this woman even existed. And this is something that people have doubted forever, right? Is this just sort of a pretense for writing poetry? And one of the things that Petrarch does rather brilliantly is he makes Laura into a kind of passageway for his soul into thoughts of high love. And courtly love was part of the troubadour poetic tradition that he was drawing on. But one of the things he wants to do here is to kind of elevate that into this form of learning to love something entirely and love it more than yourself. And Dante, of course, was famous with his lover Beatrice or Beatrice, was famous for kind of localizing his passion for heaven in this romantic love. And Petrarch's doing something kind of similar, although he's I think more unabashedly enamored of this Laura. So here's what he has to say about her, because he's defending himself against the charge that this is all a kind of artifice, that none of it's sincere, none of it's real. But here's what he writes privately in his own copy of the poet Virgil. He has this beautiful copy of Virgil, and in his manuscript, he writes the following. He says, Laura, illustrious through her own virtues, and long famed through my verses, a little self-plug there, first appeared to my eyes in my youth in the year of our Lord, 1327, on the 6th day of April, in the church of St. Clare in Avignon, at Matins. And in the same city, also on the 6th day of April, at the same first hour, but in the year 1348, the light of her life was withdrawn from the light of day, while I, as it chanced, was in Verona, unaware of my fate. So this is a very, it's kind of hard to believe that it was really this neat. He has this symbolism, right, that on the same day, several years later, Laura dies. As he sees Laura in 1327, then she dies the same day many years later. And there's liturgical symbolism to it as well, because he sees her first on Good Friday. So it's just rich with this symbolism, this day of commemorating the suffering of Christ. And he folds this into the poetry as a way of making his romantic love kind of a stand-in for or an analog to the relationship between Christ and humanity. But he's also, of course, calling up all these classical allusions as well. Let's read two of the most famous examples here. One about his first seeing Laura, and one about her death. So this is poem 3 is the first one that I'm going to read. He says, "It was the day when the sun's rays turned pale with grief for his maker when I was taken, and I did not defend myself against it. For your lovely eyes, lady, bound me. It did not seem to me a time for being on guard against love's blows. Therefore, I went confident and without fear, and so my misfortunes began in the midst of the universal woe," that is the commemoration of Christ's death, right? "Love found me altogether disarmed," because he didn't think he was going to fall in love on this sorrowful day, "and the way opened through my eyes to my heart, my eyes which are now the portal and passageway of tears. Therefore, as it seems to me, it got him no honor to strike me with an arrow in that state, and not even to show his bow to you, who were armed." So this is a highly classical set of allusions. The idea that your eyes are the portal of love, and that Cupid, the boy with the bow, will shoot and wound you. Love as a wound is also a big part of, the kind of Italian, or rather the Latin tradition here. The Virgil, for example, writes a great deal about this, especially in Book 4 of the Aeneid, right? There's just all of this classical tradition here, but he's situating it in Good Friday and creating this kind of tension between the Christian story of the death of Christ and his wounding by love and his falling in love with this woman whom he could never have. This is poem 283, and it's about her death. "You have discolored, death, the most beautiful face that was ever seen, and extinguished the most beautiful eyes. You have loosed the spirit most on fire with ardent virtues from the most charming and most beautiful bodily knot. In one instant you have taken from me all my wealth. You have imposed silence on the gentlest accents that were ever heard, and filled me with laments. Whatever I see and whatever I hear is painful to me. My lady does indeed come back to console so much sorrow, for pity leads her back, nor do I find any other help in this life. And if I could tell how she speaks and how she shines, I would inflame with love not only a man, but a tiger's or a bear's heart. So Laura, Petrarch tells us elsewhere, died of the Black Plague, of the Black Death. And this was a disease which was ravaging Europe at this time. Petrarch himself survived it, but many of those close to him did not. And he folds his grief over Laura's death into this larger narrative that he has about his own spiritual journey and her exaltation. It's kind of important that he can never have her. That's part of this series of poems. And this, she dies kind of almost not by judgment of God, but by this act of God that is currently sweeping through Europe. It's just terrible, terrible plague. And you take this classical idea of the wounding of love, which is all over Virgil and the classical poets. And then you turn it into this kind of Christianizing, purifying flame, this thing that it pierces through Petrarch's heart, but it also sort of draws him out into this image of Laura, the pure, the beautiful. Now, Laura herself may have actually been married. We don't totally know who she was, but she might have been Laura the Novice who was married. And certainly Petrarch kind of never really consummates his passions. He does have illegitimate children, but not with her. And so he's constructing out of some kind of personal biographical truth. He's constructing this kind of poetic world. And there's this endless argument, is this a PR campaign or is it the real thing? And just what is it, And we just never quite know really what's true and what's false. And that's part of the game, that's part of kind of what he's doing. And ultimately, of course, it doesn't quite matter except as a point of interest, right? I think what we know is that he's drawing out of his intimate personal experiences this very carefully detailed and carefully constructed contribution to the history of Western poetry, which is to bring pagan poetry and classical poetry alive in this Christian Italian mode. Now, let's talk briefly a little bit about what he was trying to do more generally here, right? Because he's resurrecting the classical model in the Italian Christian world. And it has been noted that he basically came up with the idea of the Dark Ages, the reason that we sort of think of the period before the Renaissance and as this period of no humanism, just this morass of ignorance, right? This kind of superstition and feeling about in the dark. By the way, totally untrue, right? I mean, Aquinas, for example, who is a medieval philosopher, is one of the great philosophers in the Western tradition. So on that level, people kind of think of this as like a PR campaign, which people typically argue about, well, was there really this shift into logic and reason? To some extent, yes, the Renaissance did recover a lot of things. And there was this great flourishing of art and science as well. But on the other hand, we don't actually acknowledge the complexity of what Petrarch meant when he was talking about Dark Ages. We sort of think of this as like, well, everything sucked before and now it's great. But the metaphor as he uses it kind of cuts both ways because he's acknowledging here also that the pagans were in darkness before Christ. And we've talked now already about how complicated that was for Petrarch. And he would write extensively throughout his life on the fact that certain people had good ideas, even though they too, in the classical period, were in Dark Ages. So that's part of it. And I'm taking here from an interesting essay called Petrarch's Conception of the Dark Ages, which you can find, Theodore E. Mommsen, Speculum 1942, if you want to go look that one up. But let me just pull some of the quotes here that Mommsen selects, and in which Petrarch, for example, says that Cicero, whom remember he loved, he thought was great, Cicero lived at the end of the darkness and the night of error, before the dawn of the true light, that being Jesus, right? But then at the same time, he says, amidst the errors there shone forth men of genius, and no less keen were their eyes, although they were surrounded by darkness and dense gloom. Therefore they ought not so much to be hated for their erring, but pitied for their ill fate. And so that's this kind of, that there's this double edge to the idea of darkness. Not just that the era before Petrarch was dark, but that also he has this interest in people who lived in light when the dark was still over the world. Right? Before Christ, there were still people who had this kind of enlightenment in advance of Christ's coming. The real place that this idea gets expressed in his own period is this letter from a trip to Rome that he took in 1341, in which he says the Romans themselves don't study or understand the greatness of their past. They don't get what heritage they have because they've given up on classical antiquity. He says, who can doubt that Rome would rise up again if she but began to know herself? And he describes here the experience of walking around the city. He says, after the fatigue of walking over the immense circuit of the city, we used often to stop at the baths of Diocletian. Sometimes we even climbed upon the vaulted roof of that once magnificent building, for nowhere is there a healthier air, a wider prospect, or more silence and desirable solitude. There we did not talk of business, nor of private or public affairs on which we had shed tears enough. As we walked over the walls of the shattered city or sat there, the fragments of the ruins were under our very eyes. Our conversation often turned on history, which we appeared to have divided up between us in such a fashion that in modern history you, in ancient history I, he's writing to Colonna here, seemed to be more expert, and ancient were called those events which took place before the name of Christ was celebrated in Rome and adored by the Roman emperors. Modern, however, the events from that time to the present. And so this is this kind of double idea that he has, that there was a time of darkness before Christ, but there's also now this time of darkness where we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater, where we don't have the classical learning that would enable us to be as great as we really could be. And as I've now described kind of at great length, he has this effort in the sonnets and in his lyric poetry to find a way of pulling all of these strands together. I'm going to read now one more poem, which I think is really one of the most remarkable poems in the Rima Sparsa. And I will attempt to read it in Italian so that we can hear the rhyme scheme that I was talking about here, this ABBA idea, and then I will read it in English. So here's poem 16. Movessi il vecchierel canuto e bianco, del dolce loco ova su età fornita, e dalla famigliuola spigottita, che vede il caro padre venir manco. Indi traendo poi l'antico fianco, per l'estreme giornate di sua vita, quanto più può col buon voler saita, rotto dagli anni e dal cammino stanco. E viene a Roma, seguendo il desio, per mirar la sembianza di colui ch'ancor lassù nel ciel vedere spera. Così, lasso, talor vo cercand'io, donna, quanto è possibile in altrui, la disiata vostra forma vera. So I hope that native Italian speakers will forgive me for my pronunciation, but you can hear at least, right, the rhythm and the rhyme. And this is something, it's a little looser in Italian than it is sometimes in English, but you do tend to have these sort of 5 stresses and this sort of 10 or 11 syllable roughly line. And then you get canuto et bianco, a sua età fornita, spigottita, venir manco. Bianco, fornita, spigottita, manco. And it goes back and forth in that way. And it is this kind of intricately structured, there's this turn. So let's read now in English so that I can show you sort of how the ideas work in it, right? He says, the little white-haired, pale old man leaves the sweet place where he has filled out his age and his fear-stricken little family, who watch their dear father disappear. Thence, dragging his ancient flanks through the last days of his life as much as he can, he helps himself with good will, broken by the years and tired by the road, and he comes to Rome, following his desire to gaze on the likeness of him whom he hopes to see again up there in heaven. Thus, alas, at times I go searching in others, lady, as much as is possible for your longed-for true form. So he starts out, he's imagining, this is not somebody he's introduced before. He's imagining this little white-haired old man at the end of his life, sitting in his sort of family home. And suddenly he gets up and he drags his exhausted body to Rome. And that's the first part, the first 8 lines describing that. And then the volta, the turn comes, and we realize why. Why he's going, because before he dies, he wants to look at the veil of Veronica, which is this artifact with Christ's face imprinted in it. And he wants to look at that veil and imagine the real Christ with whom he will soon be when he dies. And then finally, this last little coda, this last 3-line stanza, thus, alas, at times I go searching in others, lady, as much as is possible for your longed for true form. Hot damn. This is like a really crazy poem. I mean, the text message version of this poem is like, sometimes I try to satisfy my longing for you with other women, the same way a dying old man might satisfy his longing for Jesus with a picture of him. Which is like so sacred and profane at the same time, right? This elevation of this deep, passionate desire for this woman whom he can't have. So he sleeps with these other women maybe, or he goes around with these other women. And it's like the yearning of an old man's heart for his home in heaven. And so it's like, is he elevating himself out of his baser passions, Petrarch, or is he kind of bringing the sacred down into this profane world? It's a little bit of both, I think, but we tend to emphasize the profane part of it. But the kind of heights of it are real too. Also, this kind of elevation of the human experience of being in love, even if we ultimately don't approve morally of what he does, or, however we feel about his actions, we nevertheless sort of see the reality and the humanity in it. It kind of expands the world of our mind, and it sort of portrays for us just what it can be to be in love, all using these kind of both classical ideas, this idea of Rome, and the l'antico fianco is this, this kind of very sort of marble idea of like this old marbled statue of an old man almost. And then at the same time, of course, the Christian imagery. Right? So really sophisticated, beautiful stuff. And it's all part of his project, right, of trying throughout his life to bring life back to old Rome, to classical antiquity in the Christian world. And there's one last thing that I want to read, which is from his speech in Rome, accepting his coronation as poet laureate. So it's a huge honor, big moment in his career. And he makes this speech in which he elevates classical learning. And he says a bunch of stuff about, what Rome used to be and what Rome is now. And he's, there on the Capitoline Hill, which is this hugely historically important area and also important in this moment. And here's what he says to this crowd. He says, "The honor of the Republic stirs my heart when I recall that in this very city of Rome, the capital of the world, as Cicero calls it, in this very Roman capital where we now are gathered, so many and such great poets, having attained to the highest and most illustrious mastery of their art, have received the laurel crown they had deserved, but that now this custom seems rather to have been lost than to have been merely laid aside, and not lost merely, but reduced to a matter of strange legendary, and discontinued for more than 1,200 years. For we do not read that anyone has been decorated with this honor since the illustrious poet Statius, who flourished in the time of Domitian. I am moved also by the hope that, if God wills, I may renew in the now aged republic a beauteous custom of its flourishing youth. And here, not as a matter of vain boasting, but for the sake of the truth, I venture to relate that at one and the same time, a year or so ago, I was invited both to Rome and to Paris, rivaling each other in their invitations to receive this honor, to Rome by the Senate that was then in office and by certain noblemen of Rome, some of whom were present in this gathering, and to Paris by that excellent man, Master Robert, Chancellor of the University of Paris. This is kind of sly, right? He's giving you his resume, as he says, but I'm not bragging. I'm just telling you something, and by other well-known men of that city and that university. And although I hesitated for a time because of the present fame of that university, I finally decided to come hither. Why, I ask you, if not for the very reason that Virgil gives, vicit amor patriae, love of fatherland, conquers. I was much moved also toward this decision by a certain affection and reverence for those ancient poets of excellent genius who flourished in this very city, who lived here, who are buried here, even as Cicero well says in the second book of his Laws, I regard this as a sound reason for your coming here by preference and your loving this place. So you get a lot of Petrarch in here, right? You get the kind of arrogance and self-absorption. You get the mysterious, how serious is he about anything? But you also get, I think, this quite sincere desire to take what is rich and beautiful and good about the past and revitalize it in the present. And that is why I have spent time talking with you today about Petrarch. Not because, his poetry is very beautiful and I like to read it aloud, so that's great. But not just because of that, but because we too are in what I believe will one day be looked at as a new dark age. I think that the situation in which Petrarch found himself, where the customs of the old ways had fallen out of favor and out of fashion, and nobody even kind of knew that they were sitting on this mound of greatness. That's where we are too. And the caution that Petrarch gives us is not to try and kind of undo modernity, but rather to find ways that God Almighty, endlessly creative as he is, will revitalize and bring back to life the traditions of the West here and now in tech, right? In podcasting. That's why honestly, that's why this is a podcast and not a book, right? Because I'd happily write a book, but like the modern form, the new form is podcasting, right? All this new stuff, going to space. I know I harp on that all the time, but right? Those are the places where we have to carry the wisdom of the past and find new ways to express and revitalize them for our era. That's what Petrarch did. That's what we can do. The West is not dead. It is always resurrectable. And that's what we're here to do. Let's do the mailbag. Somebody asked, in fact, a few people have been asking me about this idea of the classical education that this podcast is here to give you, right? This podcast is here to revitalize some form of the classical education that you may not have gotten, right? Because it's that too is something that has fallen out of favor. And having just said that we're not going to go back to, medieval schoolhouses, that's not kind of what I'm imagining here. But knowing that we're in a period when coronavirus has basically decimated the public school system, which already was in a state of extreme decrepitude, in my opinion. And people are rediscovering the power of homeschooling. They are doing things that they would never otherwise have done, like forming these pods of families that all learn from one teacher. Charter schools, school choice, all of this stuff is kind of suddenly people are like, maybe this is a good idea since the teachers' unions have basically shut down the schools. What do we actually teach in a classical education? That's what people have been asking me. What do we do now that we have, conservatives need to seize this moment. People, not even just like political conservatives, but people that want to return some awareness of the West into the world and need to return to it in this moment and in this like particularly modern coronavirus time. And so I think that one great model is actually kind of a model that was developed throughout the medieval period. It has roots in classical antiquity, roots in Plato and Aristotle, really in many ways kind of formalized, at least in part, by Boethius, who was this kind of very, very end of the Roman Empire philosopher who wrote in prison much of the time because he was persecuted by the state. But this idea of the trivium and the quadrivium, and that's Latin for 3 ways, 3 roads, and 4 roads. And the trivium is the kind of rudimentary, the basics, which you teach, and those are grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And again, our English grammar is not the same as the Latin grammar, although I do think Latin should be taught in schools, right? But like this idea that those notions can be modernized. They are not old, outdated things. They are still the core of how we think about things and how we relate to one another, right? Logic is the center of how we think about things. And rhetoric is the center of how we communicate with one another. And those are exactly the things that our identity politics friends think is like, only for white people or whatever nonsense, right? That's the thing you got to shrug off. You got to shrug that off. This is for everybody. It's actually for young kids, right? Young kids desire this kind of formation. It's natural to them, even though sometimes they bellyache about it. It is not a kind of indoctrination. It's giving them the full inheritance of their humanity to school them in the disciplines of those 3 things, which are the fundament of freedom, right? We think of them as these kind of impositions, but they're not. They're the way. Learning to express yourself in coherent, full sentences is not an imposition. It's a gift and a kind of freedom, because then you can say whatever you want, having learned these rules by careful rote. That's the trivium. The quadrivium is 4 mathematical subjects, which has a much larger sense of math than we tend to have. Mathematike is the Greek idea here, and another related term is musike, where we get our word for music, but it's these disciplines of the mind over which the muses preside. So you have astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and music. And music is an interesting one, but it is mathematically dictated. It has to do with the relationships between different quantities, right? That's sort of how music works. So the trivium and the quadrivium are the kind of foundation stones of a classical education that we talk about them all the time without ever really mentioning them here on this podcast. That has to be the core of our education going forward. It's not outdated. We can still do it. Thanks for listening. If you like this show, you will love the work that we do at the Claremont Institute. We produce 2 publications, The American Mind and the Claremont Review of Books. Now is an especially good time to be returning to the American ideals. You can donate by going to claremont.org/donate to support our work, and tell them in the notes that we sent you so that they will know that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics. Thanks again for listening. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.